So during this season of Advent, we're being invited to hear the stories and the perspectives of various characters from that first story of Christmas. And it really is interesting to consider how the exact same events, the events surrounding Jesus' birth, can be perceived and understood so differently by different people. For example, Caesar Augustus, the emperor of Rome, issued a decree that all the world should be enrolled for the purposes of taxation. What did that mean? How was that proclamation perceived? Well, for Caesar, it meant more money for his grandiose plans. It's been said that Caesar found Rome brick and he left it in marble. That kind of transformation takes money that he gleaned from taxes. Herod, the king of Judea, for him that decree meant potential trouble. The people he ruled were always grumbling about taxes and Rome's demands, so another decree could mean another uproar. For the people of Judea, it meant another burden added to their already oppressed situation. It was a reminder that they were a subject people with the heel of Rome on their necks. For Mary and Joseph, it meant a difficult journey at a most inconvenient time in Mary's pregnancy, right as she was about to give birth. And then later, on a starry night, angels proclaimed to shepherds that Jesus was born. What did that mean? How was that proclamation perceived? Well, to Caesar, it probably meant nothing. Like, why would a baby born to a peasant couple mean anything to him in some far-off province? He could have cared less. But to Herod, it meant that there had possibly been the birth of a new plot, a new threat to his throne. To the people of Bethlehem, it probably meant little. They probably slept unaware. But to Mary and Joseph, it meant indescribable joy at the birth of their firstborn child. And then later, after a visit from wise men, Herod decreed that every child 2 years old and younger in Bethlehem should be killed. What did that mean? How was that proclamation perceived? Well, to Caesar, he probably laughed, thinking Herod was truly paranoid, seeing threats in every possible direction. To King Herod, it meant he had once again destroyed another potential enemy, another potential threat. He had no pangs of guilt, no sense of remorse or conscience. To people of Bethlehem, that decree meant profound grief and a growing, raging, righteous anger. To Mary and Joseph, awe and fear, awe that an angel had warned them, and so they were safe, and yet fear because now they really understood that their child's life would never be normal. Already, he was a threat to those who were in power. You know, if Herod hadn't been so incredibly brutal, we might almost be able to feel just a little bit of pity for him. He so desperately wanted to be revered and remembered, and he was so sure that his wealth, that his construction projects, that his appointment by king would assure him a prominent place in history books, and yet he was outdone by a baby. His greatest threat was a baby born to a peasant family in some tiny little town, no one hardly even ever heard of it, Nazareth. We might feel some pity, but Herod was just so cruel. Think about his chilling words. I'll be merciful. I'm not going to have the whole town executed, just the babies 2 years old and under. Herod was just so brutal. So it is a little unusual for us to spend so much time thinking about his story and his perspective during this season of Advent when we're anticipating great joy. And yet there Herod is. He's right in the middle of the story. And so if we don't just race past him, but spend a little bit of time on his story and his perspective, I think we might actually be able to find from it some lessons, some good lessons about God's compassion and about God's strength. So somehow, Herod really came to believe that he was more important, that he was far more superior to pretty much anybody else. He had such an exploding ego. He was so self-centered. He had no room in his life or in his heart for compassion. He was so self-absorbed. He never even thought about trying to figure out what it might be like to be somebody else. Like what it would be like to be someone who had to earn a living, who might have gone hungry now and then, who loved family, someone who had faith in God. So we see Herod up there in the Herodian, walking along, looking down at the people and thinking about how he could continue to command their loyalty with brute force. There's Herod walking on those balconies, feeling superior, literally looking down on people. How different is God? Because God became one of us. When God decided that humanity needed some instruction, that people needed a divine revelation, God decided to look humanity right in the eye. God became born as a baby. God didn't stay in some lofty place out there above there somewhere looking down. No, God came to earth as a baby. God became one of us, God incarnate. And the revelation that God brought to us had nothing to do with force or brutality. It was all about divine love. So just think about this Christmas story and how really marvelous it is. Because surely God could have found other ways to provide us the revelation that we needed, and yet no other method would have been nearly as effective. Jesus was born a baby, raised in a family. He learned a trade, carpentry, and he was schooled in the faith. And it was the way he lived his life, the words he spoke, the lessons he offered, that he convinced and persuaded people that he was the revelation of God, that he brought the true message of God, and that message of God was all about love. God understood that people need to engage their minds as well as their hearts when they're making decisions about faith. That our minds need to be engaged in understanding God and faith. And so rather than using coercion or force, which only breeds mistrust, God brought in Jesus who convinced us that he was right about the very nature of God, and that nature is divine love. It's been said that Herod might have been king by might, but Jesus was king by right. So Herod looked down on people. God became one of us. And even more, Herod had this unquenchable thirst for power. And he used every means possible to demonstrate his power and to hold on to that power. He didn't care if he had to be bloody or brutal. He did absolutely everything he possibly could to show himself, to show the world, to show the people he ruled that he was most powerful, even a little bit more powerful and a little smarter than God. So scattered across Israel are the ruins of Herod's attempts to prove how much smarter he was than God. Because with slaves dying in the construction process, Herod consistently readjusted creation wherever he thought God might have made a mistake. And so in the dry desert of Jericho, Herod built a palace, and of course it had pools all around it. He didn't like how God had created the Mediterranean Sea, and so Herod decided to add some walls here and there in order to create a port. And then there was this palace, the Herodian. It was outside of Jerusalem, looked down at Bethlehem, and it was huge. It was his favorite palace. It had a banquet hall that was the size of a football field. It had 200 marble stairs. It had arcades. It had hot baths. And it was on a hill. But there hadn't been a hill there before. But Herod wanted it a hill, so he had one created because God forgot to put one there. Herod attempted to show with his construction projects how important he was, how powerful he was. And yet, Herod was always afraid that he was about to lose his power. Was Herod appropriately frightened, or was he paranoid? It's a little hard to know because there were constantly conspiracies being developed in order to overthrow him because he was so very brutal. And so he had 10 wives, numerous sons, and yet when he died, he had a far less heirs because every time a family member might talk about, Dad, maybe it's time for you to retire, he just would have them killed. He was brutal in his desire to hold on to his power. And so when he heard that there was a baby born in Bethlehem, rather than think about that threat, he just did all he could to get rid of it and to execute that baby. Herod hoarded on to power with his brute force. Think how different God is, because God just gives it away. God gives away strength and power. God gave strength and power away thousands of years ago. Mary and Joseph heard that their life was going to be changed by angels, and they had the courage to follow and do what God asked of them. Shepherds heard these weird voices coming out of the heavens, and they courageously went to Bethlehem to find out what was going on. Those wise men had the courage to defy Herod and not return to him. For thousands of years, God has just freely given away power, not held on to it, not hoarded it, but freely given it away. God did that before, and God continues to do it today. The author Maya Angelou was once asked in an interview, what was the most memorable moment in her life? And people expected her to talk about, a time when she met someone famous or maybe reading a poet at an inauguration. But instead, she talked about that moment when she fully knew and fully understood that God loved her and the strength that that provided for her. And so Maya said this, I knew that if God loved me, then I could do wonderful things. I could try great things, learn anything, achieve anything. For what could stand against me with God, since one person, any person with God, constitutes the majority? That knowledge humbles me, melts my bones, closes my ears, makes my teeth rock loosely in my gums, and it liberates me. I'm a bird winging over high mountains down into serene valleys. I am ripples of waves on silver seas. I'm a spring leaf trembling in anticipation. Herod hoarded and brutally amassed power. God just gives it away to any of us who need it. Herod looked down on people. God became one of us. Herod hoarded power. God just gives it away. Sometimes I wonder what it was like for Mary and Joseph on that night in Bethlehem. If they looked up and they saw the flames of Herod's torches on the Herodian, what must that have felt like for them? I just hope their eyes didn't linger there very long and they just kept looking up into the heavens. The shepherd last week told us that we ought to look up now and then. Herod, he just never did. I think we should.